Alright, folks. Just a moment. Let me get to what we're on about. What we're reading today is Into the Ocean's Depths by Sewell Peaslee Wright. But before we start, I should elucidate. I should let you all know. I am recording in a different place today because I'm too nice and I didn't want to kick my roommate and his gal out of the room. So I decided that I'm going to record in the lounge. It's going to be a little echoey. Oh well. Such is fate. You know? Also, I think someone followed me between streams the other day. Yeah. The other day, this guy followed me. So I'm just going to run that again. CR Fog has followed. Thank you much. You followed a good long while ago. But I just now mentioned. Let me change my stream title. Hello? Let me change my stream title. Just a moment. I almost completely spaced on that. Right now it's something else because I was playing Rocksmith and my computer was like, no, don't do that. So let me go to my channel. And change that because I'm not playing Rocksmith. So let me go to my channel. Oh jeez, it's gonna echo, isn't it? And change that because I'm not playing Rocksmith. Oh yeah, it's echoing. Golly. Shh. Paper cuts. Oh yeah, it's echoing. Talk shows. Alright, now shush. Alright, so now I got my chat. And also, this is the start of something new for the YouTube channel as well. It means that I'm just gonna upload this video straight. You actually get to see me now on YouTube. You don't have to just look at this pleasant art that's on the other side of the camera because everything's mirrored. That pleasant art up there. It's not the only thing you have to look at now. Now you can look at my face. Golly. And also the bit cup and the progress bar, which, by the way, hey, I'm pointing the wrong way. This way. The progress bar. You know what that's for? That's for donations. It means you can donate money to me. There's a link in the bottom of the Twitch channel, and I'll probably start linking it in the paper cuts descriptions now. But anyway, I digress. Let's grab ourselves a small drink of water and begin. As I said before, we are reading Into the Ocean's Depths, which is apparently a sequel to an earlier set of... oh yeah, that was the mermaid story. A sequel to From the Ocean's Depths. Nice. Anyway, let's begin. Chapter 1. I read the telegram for a second time, and then I folded it up, put it in my pocket, and pressed the little button on my desk. My mind was made up. To save Imy's race of men who return to the sea, 2 landmen answer the challenge. Oh, dang it. It describes images, and I didn't notice that was an image box. I digress. Miss Fentress, I'm leaving this afternoon on an extended trip. The Florida address will reach me after Thursday. Tell Wade and Bennett to carry on. I think you have everything in hand. Is everything clear to you? Yes, Mr. Taylor. Miss Fentress wasn't in the least surprised. She was used to my sudden trips. The outfit got along perfectly without me. Sometimes I think my frequent absences were good for the business. The boys worked like the devil to make a fine showing while I was away. And Miss Fentress was a perfect gem of a secretary. I had nothing to worry about there. All right, fine. Will you get my diggings on the phone? I hurriedly put my few papers in place and signed a couple of letters, and then Joseph was on the wire. Joseph, pack my bags right away. For Florida, the usual things, yes. Right away. I'll be leaving by noon. Yes, driving through. That was that. There were a few more letters to sign, a few hasty introductions to be given regarding 1 or 2 matters that were hanging fire, and then on my way to the bachelor apartment, I read the telegram through again. Think it worthwhile if you feel adventurous and have nothing pressing to come to the monstrosity stop. Make it your will first stop. Shall always look for you any day, as I know you are always looking for excitement and never have anything important to do, so don't bother to wire. Perhaps we shall see her again. Mercer. I smiled at Mercer's frank opinion of my disposition and my importance to my business, but I frowned over the admission to make my will, and the last telling statement in the wire, perhaps we'll see her again. I knew who he meant by her. Joseph had my bags waiting for me, a few hurried instructions, most of them shouted over my shoulder, and I was purring down along the main drag, my duffel in the rumble, and the roadster headed due south. Perhaps we'll see her again. Those words from the telegram kept coming before my eyes. Mercer knew what he was about if he wanted my company. Mercer knew what he was about if he wanted my company when he put that line in his wire. I've already told the story of our first meeting with the strange being from the ocean's depths that, wounded and senseless, had been flung up on the beach near Warren Mercer's Florida estate. In all the history of civilization, no stranger bit of flotsam had ever been cast up by a storm. Shout out to that clock bell off in the distance, everybody's favorite. Anyway, neither of us would ever forget that slim white creature swathed in her veil of long light golden hair as she crouched on the bottom of Mercer's swimming pool and pictured for us by means of Mercer's thought telegraph, my own name for the device. He has a long and scientific title for it with as many joints as a centipede. The story of her people. They had lived in a country of steaming mist when the world was very young. They had been forced into the sea to obtain food, and after many generations they had gone back to the sea as man once emerged from it. They'd grown webs on their hands and feet and breathed oxygen dissolved in water as fish do, instead of taking it from the atmosphere. And under the mighty Atlantic somewhere were their villages. The girl had pictured all these things for us, and then, nearly a year ago now, she'd pleaded with us to let her return to her people. And so we had put her back into the sea, and she'd bade us farewell. But just before she disappeared, she'd done a strange thing. She had pointed under the water out toward the depths, and then with a broad, sweeping motion of her arm, she indicated the shore, as though to promise, it seemed to me, that it seemed she'd return. And now Mercer had said we might see her again? Mercer, conservative and scientific, wasn't the man to make rash promises, but how? The best way to solve the riddle was to reach Mercer, and I broke the speed laws of 5 states 3 days running. I didn't even stop at my own little shack. It was only 4 miles from there to the huge, rather neglected estate, built in boom times by some newly rich promoter and dubbed by Mercer the monstrosity. Hardly bothering to slow down, I turned off the concrete onto the long, weed-grown gravel drive, and shot between the 2 massive stuccoed pillars that guarded the drive. Their corroded bronze plates, bearing the original title of the estate, the Billows, were a promise that my long, hard drive was nearly at an end. As soon as the huge, rambling structure was fairly in sight, I pressed the flat of my hand on the horn button, and by the time I came to a lock-wheel halt, with the gravel rattling on my fenders, Mercer was there to greet me. "It's 10 o'clock. I'd said noon is the hour of your arrival. You certainly must have made time, Taylor." "I did." I nodded rather grimly, recalling 1 or 2 narrow squeaks. "But who wouldn't with a wire like this?" I produced the crumpled telegram rather dramatically. "You got a lot to explain." "I know it. Come on and we'll mix highballs with the story." Locked arm in arm, we entered the house together and settled ourselves in the huge living room. Mercer, I could see at a glance, was thinner and browner than when we had parted, but otherwise he was the same lithe, soft-mannered little scientist I'd known for years, dark-eyed with an almost beautiful mouth, outlined by a slim, closely cropped and very black mustache. "Well, here's to our lady from the sea," proposed Mercer when Carson, his butler, had brought the drinks and departed. I nodded and we both sipped at our highball. "Briefly, this is the story. You and I know that somewhere beneath the Atlantic there are people who went back to whence they came. We've seen one of these people, and I propose that since they cannot come to us, we go to them. I have made preparations, and I wanted you to have the opportunity of going with me if you wish." "But, Mercer, how and what—" He interrupted with a quick, nervous gesture. "I'll show you presently. I believe it can be done. It'll be a dangerous adventure, though. I wasn't joking when I advised you to make your will. An uncertain venture, too, but I believe most wonderfully worthwhile." His eyes were shining now with all the enthusiasm of a scientist and a dreamer. "Well, Sounds mighty appealing, but how... Finish your drink and I'll show you. I downed what was left of my highball in two mighty gulps. Lead me to it, Mercer. He smiled a quiet smile and led his way to what had been the billiard room of the Billows, but what was the laboratory of the monstrosity. The first thing my eyes fell upon were two gleaming metal objects suspended from chains let into the ceiling. Diving suits, rather different from whatever you've seen. And they were different. The body was a perfect globe, as was the headpiece. The legs were cylindrical and jointed at the knee and thigh with huge discs. The feet were solid metal, curved, rocker-like on the bottom, and at the ends of the arms were the three hooked talons. The concave sides of two talons facing the concave side of the third. The arms were hinged at the elbow just as the legs were hinged, but there was a huge ball and socket joint at the shoulder. Mercer, no human being could stand up with that much metal on and around them. Well, you're mistaken, Taylor. That's not solid metal, you see. It's an aluminum alloy that's not nearly as heavy as it looks. There are two walls, slightly over an inch apart, braced by innumerable trusses. The fabric is nearly as strong as that much solid metal and infinitely lighter. They work all right, Taylor. And I know because I've tried them. And this hump on the back? I asked, walking around the odd dangling figures, hanging like bloated metal skeletons from their chains. I'd thought that the bodies were perfect globes, and I could now see at the rear there was a hump-like excrescence across the shoulders. There are two other tanks inside the globular body. That shape was adopted, by the way, because a globe can withstand more pressure than any other shape, and we may have to go where pressures are very high. So we don these things and stroll out into the Atlantic, looking for the girl and her friends. Hardly. They are not quite the apparel for so long a stroll. You haven't seen all the marvels yet, though. Come along. He led the way through the patio, beside the pool in which our strange visitor from the depths had lived, during her brief stay with us, and out into the open again. As we neared the sea, I became aware for the first time of a faint, muffled hammering sound, and I glanced at Mercer inquiringly. Just a second. There she is, Taylor. I stood still and stared. In a little cove, cradled in a cunning, spidery structure of wood, a submarine was resting upon the waves. Good heavens, you're going into this right, Mercer? Yes, because I think it's immensely worthwhile. Come along and let me show you the Santa Maria, named after Columbus's flagship. Come on. Two men with army automatics strapped significantly to their belts nodded courteously as we came up. They were the only men in sight, but from the hammering going on inside, there must have been a sizable crew busy in the interior. A couple of raw pine shacks, some little distance away, provided quarters for, I guessed, 20 or 30 men. Had her shipped down in pieces, the boat that brought it to lay offshore, and we lightered the parts ashore. A tremendous job, but she'll be ready for the water in a week, 10 days at the latest. You're really a wonder, Mercer, I said, and I meant it. Mercer patted the red-leaded side of the submarine affectionately. Later I'll take you inside, but they're busy as the devil in there, and the sound of the hammers fairly makes your head ring. You'll see it all later anyway, if you'd like to share the adventure with me. Listen, I grinned as we turned back toward the house. It'll take more than those two lads with the pop guns to keep me out of the Santa Maria when she sails or dives or whatever it is she's supposed to do. Mercer laughed softly, and we walked the rest of the way in silence. I imagine we were both busy with our thoughts, and I know that I was. And several times as we walked along, I looked back over my shoulder toward the ungainly red monster straddling on her spindling wooden legs, and toward the smiling Atlantic glistening serenely in the sun. Mercer was so busy Mercer was so busy with 1,001 details that I found myself very much in the way if I followed him around, so I decided to loaf instead. For weeks after we'd put our strange girl visitor back into the sea from whence Mercer had taken her, I'd watched from a comfortable seat well above the high water mark that commanded the section ashore. I was sure that by that strange gesture of hers she meant to return, and so I located my old seat and found that it had been used a great deal since I'd left it. There were whole winnows of cigarette butts, some of them quite fresh, all around. Mercer, cold-blooded scientist as he was, still had hoped against hope that she would return too. It was a very comfortable seat in the shade of a little cluster of palms, and for the next several days I spent most of my time there reading and smoking and, well, watching. No matter how interesting the book, I found myself every few seconds lifting my eyes to search the beach and the sea. I'm not sure, but I think it was my 8th day after the arrival that I looked up and saw, for the first time, something besides the smiling beach and a ceaseless procession of incoming rollers. For an instant I doubted what I saw, and then with a cry that stuck in my throat, I dropped my book, unheeded, to the sand and raced toward the shore. She was there. White and slim, her pale gold hair clinging to her body and gleaming like polished metal in the sun, she stood for a moment, while the spray frothed at her thighs. Behind her, crouching below the surface, I could distinguish 2 other forms. Excuse me. She had returned, and this time not alone. One long, slim arm shot out toward me, held level with the shoulder, the well-remembered gesture of greeting. Then she too crouched below the surface that she might breathe. As I ran out onto the wet sand, the waves splashing around my ankles all unheeded, she rose again, and now I could see her lovely smile in her dark glowing eyes. I was babbling, though I don't remember what. Before I could reach her, she smiled and sank again below the surface. I waded on out, laughing excitedly, and as I came close to her, she bobbed up again out of the spray, and we greeted each other in the manner of her people, hands outstretched, each gripping the shoulder of the other. She made a quick motion then, with both hands, as though she'd placed a cap upon the shining glory of her head, and I understood in an instant what she wished. The antenna of Mercer's thought telegraph, by the aid of which she had told us the story of herself and her people. I nodded and smiled, pointing to the spot where she stood, trying to show her by my expression that I understood and that by my gesture she was to wait here for me. She smiled and nodded in return, and crouched again below the surface of the heaving sea. As I turned toward the beach, I caught a momentary glimpse of the 2 who had come with her. They were a man and a woman watching me with wide, half-curious, half-frightened eyes. I recognized them instantly from the picture she'd impressed upon my mind nearly a year ago. She'd brought with her on our journey her mother and father. Stumbling, my legs shaking with excitement, I ran through the water, and with my trousers flapping against my ankles, I sprinted toward the house. I found Mercer in the lab. He looked up as I came rushing in, wet from the shoulders down, and I saw his eyes grow suddenly wide. I opened my mouth to speak, but I was still breathless. And anyway, Mercer took the words from my mouth before I could utter them. "She's come back. Taylor, she's come back, right?" He gripped me, his fingers like steel clamps, shaking me with an amazing strength. Yes. I found my breath and my voice at the same instant. "She's there, just where we put her into the sea, and there are 2 others with her, her mother and her father. Come on, Mercer, bring your thought gadget." "I can't. I've built an improvement on it in the diving armor and a sentinel instrument on the sub, but the old apparatus is strewn all over the table, just like when we used it the other time. We'll have to bring her here." "We'll get a basin, then. We'll carry her back to the pool just as we took her from it. Hurry." And so we did just that. Mercer snatched up a huge glass basin used in his chemistry experiments, and we raced down to the shore. As well as we could, we explained our wishes, and she smiled her quick smile of understanding. Crouching beneath the water, she turned to her companions, and I could see her throat move as she spoke to them. They seemed to protest, dubious and frightened, but in the end she seemed to reassure them, and we picked her up, swathed in her hair as in a silken gown, and carried her, her head immersed in the basin of water, that she might breathe in comfort, to the pool. It all took but a few minutes, although it seemed like hours. Mercer's hands were shaking as he handed me the antenna for the girl and another for myself, and his teeth were chattering as he spoke. "Hurry, Gerald. Hurry, Taylor. I set the switch so that she can do the sending while we receive. Quickly! I leapt into the pool and adjusted the antenna on her head, making sure that the 4 electrodes of the cross-curved members pressed against the front and back and both sides of her head. Then, hastily, I climbed out of the pool, seated myself on its edge, and put on my own antenna. Perhaps I should say at this time that Mercer's device for conveying thought could do no more than convey what was in the mind of the person sending. Mercer and I could convey actual words and sentences because we understood each other's language, and by thinking in words we conveyed our thoughts in words. One received the impression almost of having actually heard speech. We couldn't communicate with the girl in this fashion, however, for we didn't understand her speech. She had to convey her thoughts to us by the means of mental pictures which told her story, and this is the story of her pictures unfolded. First, sketchy, half-formed pictures, I saw her return to the village of her people, her welcome there, the curious crowds around her questioning her. The incredulous expressions as she told them of her experience were ludicrous. Her meeting with her father and mother brought a little catch to my throat, and I looked across the pool at Mercer. I knew that he, too, was glad that we'd put her back into the sea, where she'd wished to go. These pictures faded hastily, and for a moment there was only the circular swirling of gray mist. That was the symbol she'd adopted to denote the passage of time. And then slowly the picture cleared. It was the same village I'd seen before, with its ragged, warped, narrow streets, and its row of dome-shaped houses, for all the world like Eskimo igloos, but made of coral and various forms of vegetation. At the outskirts of the village I could see the gently moving, shadowy forms of weird submarine growths, and the quick darting shapes of innumerable fishes. Some few people were walking along the streets, walking with oddly springy steps. Others in a larger number darted here and there above the roofs, some hovering in the water as gulls hover in the air, lazily, but the majority apparently were on business or work to be executed with dispatch. Suddenly, into the midst of this peaceful scene, 3 figures came darting. They weren't like the people of the village, but smaller, and instead of being gracefully slim, they were short and powerful in build. They weren't white like the people of the girls' village, but swarthy, and they were dressed in a sort of tight-fitting shirt of gleaming leather of shark skin, I learned later. They carried, tucked through a sort of belt made of twisted vegetation, 2 long, slim knives of pointed stone, or perhaps bone. Oh, you must excuse me if I yawn. You just get so used to reading right before bed that it just gets you all sleepy. I must admit that I'm planning on moving on from this serial when we get to the December issue, and I'm probably just going to read them on my own. I'll probably move on to like more of a what you would expect out of a classic lit class, but only the ones I like. Or at least the ones I think I'll like. Anyway, I digress. It wasn't until they seemed to come close to me that I saw the point of difference. Their faces were scarcely human. The nose had become rudimentary, leaving a large blank expanse in the middle of their faces that gave them a peculiar... The nose had become rudimentary, leaving a large blank expanse in the middle of their faces that gave them a peculiarly hideous expression. Their eyes were almost perfectly round and very fierce, their mouths huge and fish-like. Beneath their sharp, jutting jaws, between the angle of the jaws and the spot beneath the ears, were huge longitudinal slits that intermittently showed blood red, like fresh gashes cut in the sides of their throats. I could even see a hard bony cover that protected these slits, and I realized these were very clearly gills. Here were representatives of a people that had gone back to the sea ages before that of the girls' village. Their coming caused sort of a panic in the village, and the 3 noseless creatures strode down from the principal street, grinning hugely, glancing from right to left, and showing their sharp, pointed teeth. They looked more like sharks than humans. A committee of 5 old gray men met the visitors and conducted them into one of the larger houses, and insolently, the leader of the 3 shark-faced creatures made demands, and the scene changed swiftly to make clear the nature of those demands. The village was to give a number of its finest young men and women to the shark people, about 50 of each to be servants, slaves, something along that line to the noseless ones. The scene shifted quickly to the interior of the house. The old men were shaking their heads, protesting and explaining. There was fear on their faces, but there was determination, too. One of the 3 envoys snarled and came close to the 5 old men, lifting a knife threateningly. I thought for an instant he was about to strike down one of the villagers, and then the picture dissolved into another, and I saw that he was but threatening them with what he could cause to happen. The fate of the village and the villagers, with the demands the 3 refused, was a terrible one. Hordes of the creatures came swarming, and they tore the houses apart, each with their long, slim white weapons that killed the old men and women and the children. The villagers would have fought desperately, but they were outnumbered. The shark-skin kirtles of the invaders turned their knives like armor, and the sea grew red with swirling blood that spread like scarlet smoke through the water. Then this too faded, and I saw the old men cowering, pleading with the 3 terrible envoys. The leader of the 3 shark-faced creatures spoke again. He'd give them time, a short revolving swirl of gray that indicated only a brief time, apparently, and returned for an answer. Grinning evilly, the 3 darted away, left the dome-shaped house, and darted away further, over the roofs of the village, into the dim darkness of the distant waters. I saw the girl talking to the elders. They smiled sadly and shook their heads hopelessly. She argued with them earnestly, painting a picture for them of Mercer and myself as she viewed us, tall and strong, and with great wisdom in our faces. We too walked along the streets of the village. Hordes of the shark-faced ones came, like a swarm of monstrous sharks, and the picture was very vague and nebulous, but we helped put them out. She wished us to help her. She'd convinced the elders that we could. She, her mother, and her father started out from the village. 3 times they'd fought with sharks, and each time they'd killed them. They'd found the shore to the very spot where we'd put her back into the sea. Then there was a momentary flash of the picture she'd called up, of Mercer and I putting the shark-faced hordes to rout, and then startlingly I was conscious of that high pleading sound, the sound that I'd heard once before when she'd begged us to return to her people. The sound that I knew was her word for please. And there was a little click. Mercer had turned the switch, and he would transmit now, while she and I would listen. In the center of the village, how vaguely and clumsily he pictured it, rested the Santa Maria. From the trap in the bottom, two bulging, gleaming figures emerged. Rushing up, a glimpse through the sharp faceplates revealed Mercer and myself, where the shark-faced hordes descended, and Mercer waved something like a huge bottle towards them. None of the villagers were in sight. The noseless ones swooped down on us fearlessly, knives drawn, pointed teeth revealed in fiendish grins. They didn't reach us. By dozens, by scores, they went limp and floated slowly to the floor of the ocean. Their bodies covered the streets, they sprawled across the roofs of the houses. In a few seconds, there was not one alive of the hundreds of who had come. I looked down at the girl. She was smiling up at me through the clear water, and once again, I felt the strange, strong tug at my heartstrings. Her great dark eyes glowed with a faith, with perfect confidence. A supreme faith. We had made her a promise, after all. I wonder how it would be possible to keep it. Sorry, I'm dozing. I'm like half dozy, just because this is, just reading makes me sleepy, so I'm gonna be right back. I'm gonna make some caffeine real quick. I'll return momentarily. Let me just put up the BRB. Mute my. The struggle is real, folks. I didn't have time to get hot water, so instead I'm just gonna make yerba with cold water. Mercur. I mostly didn't have time to get hot water because I was apprehensive about leaving my laptop alone relatively unattended. So instead, we're gonna make cold yerba, and it's not gonna be as good. And also, apparently, the leaves are gonna get stuck to the straw really badly. Flawless. So we're gonna let that sit for a little bit. Anyway, in the day following, the Santa Maria was launched. 2 days later, trial trips and final adjustments completed, we submerged for the great adventure. It sounds very simple when recorded thus in just a few lines, but it was by no means a simple matter. Those 3 days were full of hectic activity. Mercer and I didn't sleep more than 4 hours for any of those 3 nights. We were too busy to talk. Mercer worked frantically in his laboratory, slaving feverishly behind the big hood. I overlooked the tests of the submarine and the loading of the necessary supplies. The girl we had taken back to her parents, giving her to understand that she was to wait. They went away, but every few hours returned, as though to urge us to greater haste. And at last we were ready, the girl and her 2 companions seating themselves on the tiny deck of the Santa Maria, just forward of the conning tower, holding themselves in place by the chains. We'd already instructed the girl in her duties. We'd move slowly, and she should guide us, by pointing either to the right or the left. I'll confess I gave one last long, lingering look at the shore before the hatch of the conning tower was clamped down. I wasn't exactly afraid, but I wondered if I would ever step foot on solid land again. Standing in the conning tower beside Mercer, I watched the sea rise in an angle to meet us, and I dodged instinctively as the first green wave pelted against the thick porthole through which I was looking. An instant later, the water closed over the top of the conning tower, and at the gentle angle, we nosed toward the bottom of the sea. Question of the day: what's conning mean? Conning, the tower. Conning. It's a nautical, also a con. To direct the steering of a ship, so it's a steering tower. So it's kind of like a periscope, I guess. Right. Okay. An account of the trip itself, perhaps, does not belong on this record. It wasn't a pleasant adventure in itself, for the Santa Maria, like every undersea craft, I suppose, was close, smelly, and cramped. We proceeded very slowly, for only by doing so could our tower, holding themselves in place by the chains, We'd already instructed the girl in her duties. We would move slowly and she should guide us by pointing either to the right or the left. Oh, that's fine. I just reread the thing. Anyway, we proceeded very slowly, for only by doing so could our guide keep her bearings. And how she found the way was a mystery to all of us. We could see but very little, despite the clearness of the water. It was by no means a sightseeing trip. For various reasons, Mercer had cut our crew to the minimum. We'd had 2 navigating officers, experienced submarine men, both, and 5 sailors, also experienced in undersea work. With such a short crew, Mercer and I were both kept busy. Bonnet, the captain, was a tall chap, stooped from his years in the low, cramped quarters of the submarines. And Duke, our second officer, was a youngster, hardly out of his teens, as clever as they came. And although both of them, and the crew as well, must have been agog with questions, neither by word nor look did they express their feelings. Mercer had paid for obedience without curiosity, and he got it. We spent the first night on the bottom, for the simple reason that we'd come to the surface. We might have come down into territory familiar. Or rather, we spent the first night on the bottom for the simple reason that had we come to the surface, we might have come down into territory unfamiliar to our guide. As soon as the first faint light began to filter down, however, we proceeded, and Mercer and I crowded together into the conning tower. We're close. See how excited they are, all 3 of them. The 3 strange creatures were holding onto the chains and staring over the bulging side of the ship. Every few seconds the girl turned and looked back at us, smiling, her eyes shining with excitement. And suddenly she pointed straight down and held out her arm in an unmistakable gesture. We were to stop. Mercer conveyed the order instantly to Bonnet at the controls, and all 3 of our guides dived gracefully off the ship and disappeared in the depths below. Let her settle the bottom, Bonnet. Slowly. Bonnet handled the ship neatly, keeping her nicely trimmed, and so we came to rest on the bottom in 4 or 5 seconds, and as Mercer and I stared out eagerly through the round glass ports of the conning tower, we could see very dimly a cluster of dark, rounded projections cropping out from the bed of the ocean. We were only a few yards from the edge of the girls' village. The scene was exactly as we had pictured it, save that it was not nearly as clear and well lighted. I realized that our eyes were not accustomed to the gloom, as were those of the girl and her people, but I could distinguish the vague outlines of the houses and the slowly swaying shapes of the monstrous growths. "Well, Taylor, here we are, and here are her people," cried Mercer, his voice shaking with excitement as he peered out the glass-covered port. The whole village was swarming around us. White bodies hovered around us as moths around a light. Faces pressed against the ports and stared in at us with great amazed eyes. Ooh, I don't think this is going to be as good as actual yerba. That's not atrocious. It's not as good as warm yerba, but it's not atrocious. Then suddenly the crowd of curious creatures parted, and the girl came darting up with the 5 ancients she'd showed us before. They were evidently the elders of the village, and therefore were the council responsible for the government of the village, or something along that line, for the other villagers bowed their heads respectfully as they passed. The girl came close to the port through which I was looking and gestured earnestly. Her face was tense and anxious, and from time to time she glanced over her shoulder, as though she feared the coming of an enemy. "Our time's short, I take it, if we are to be of service. Come on, Taylor, into the diving suits." I signaled the girl that we understood and would hurry. Then I followed Mercer into our tiny stateroom. "Remember what I've told you," he said as we slipped into the heavy woolen undergarments you were to wear under the suits. "You understand how to handle your air, I believe, and you'll have no difficulty getting around in the suit if you just remember to go slowly. Your job is to get the whole village to get away when the enemy is sighted. Get them to come this way from the village towards the ship, do you understand? The current comes from this direction the way the vegetation bend shows that, and keep the girl's people away until I signal you to let them return. Remember to take your electric lantern. Don't burn it more than's necessary. The batteries aren't large, and the bulb draws a lot of current. Are you ready? Still not sure how I feel about this. I was ready, but I was shaking a little as the men helped me into the mighty armor that was to keep the pressure of several atmospheres from crushing my body. The helmet was the last piece to be donned, and when it was screwed in place, I stood there like a mummy, almost completely rigid. Click. Yes, click here to be put into the airlock. Quickly, we were put into the airlock, together with a large iron box containing a number of things Mercer needed. Darkness and water rushed in on us. The water closed over my head, and I became aware of the soft, continuous popping sounds of air bubbles escaping from the relief valve of the headpiece. For a moment, someone rang me on Skype. Buddy, I'm streaming right now. Cannot. For a moment, I was dizzy and more than a little nauseated. I could feel cold sweat pricking my forehead, and there was a sudden glow of light from before me, and I started walking towards it. I found I could walk now. Not easily, but after I caught the trick of it without too much difficulty. I could move my arms too, and the interlocking hooks that served me for fingers. When my real fingers closed upon a little crossbar at the end of the armored arms, and pulled the bars toward me, the steel claws outside came together like a thumb and two fingers. In a moment, we stood upon the bottom of the ocean. I turned my head inside the helmet, and there, beside me, was the sleek, smooth side of the Santa Maria. On my other side was Mercer, a huge, dim figure in his diving armor. He made an awkward gesture toward his head, and suddenly I remembered something. Before me, where I could operate it with a thrusting movement of my chin, was a toggle switch. I snapped it over and heard Mercer's voice. "Forget everything I tell him." "I know it. I was rather rattled." "Okay now, however. Anything I can do?" I said, mentally. "Yes, help me with this box, and then get the girl to put on the antenna you'll find there. Don't forget the knife and the light." "Right." I bent over the box with him, and we both came near falling. We opened the lid, however, and I hooked the knife and the light into their proper places outside my armor. And then, with the antenna for the girl so we could establish connections with her rather than just with ourselves, and through her with the villagers, I moved off. This antenna was completely different from the one used in our previous experiences. The four cross members that clasped the head were finer, and at their junction was a flat circular box, from which rose a black rod some 6 inches in height, and was topped by a black sphere about half the size of my fist. These perfected thought telegrams, I continued to use my own designation for them, as it was clearer and more understandable than Mercer's, didn't need connecting wires. They conveyed their impulses by Hertzian waves to a master receiver on the Santa Maria, which amplified them and rebroadcast them so that each of us could send and receive at any time. As I turned, I found the girl beside me, waiting anxiously, and beside her were the 5 ancients. I slipped the antenna over her head, and instantly she began telling me that danger was imminent. To facilitate matters, I'll describe her messages as though she spoke. Indeed, her pictures were clear, almost as speech in my native tongue. And at times she did use certain sound words. It was in this way that I learned by inference that her name was Ivy, that her people were called Timorn. This may have been the name of the community, or perhaps it was interchangeable, I'm not sure. That the shark-faced people were the Rorn. The Rorn! And two days, and then 3 again, and our old men refused to give up the slaves. Today they'll return. These Roran and my people, the Timor, and they'll all be made dead. Then I told her what Mercer had said, that she and every one of her people should flee swiftly and hide. Beyond the boat, a distance beyond the village. Mercer and I would wait here, and when the Roran came, it was they who would be made dead, as we promised. Although how I admitted to myself, being careful to hide the thought, she might not sense it, I wasn't quite sure. We'd been too busy since the girl's arrival to go into detail. She turned and spoke quickly to the old men. They looked at me doubtfully, and she urged them vehemently. They turned back toward the village, and in a moment the Timorn were stalking by obediently, losing their slim white forms in the gloom behind the dim bulk of the Santa Maria, resting so quietly on the sand. They were hardly out of sight when suddenly Mercer spoke through the antenna fitted inside my helmet. "They're coming. Look above and to your right. The Roran, as Aimee calls them. They've arrived." I looked up and beheld 100. No. 1,000 shadowy 100, no. 1,000 shadowy forms darting down upon the village, upon us. They too were just as the girl had pictured them. Short, swart beings, but with a suggestion of a nose, and with pulsing gill covers under the ankles of their jaws. Each one gripped a long, slim white knife in either hand, and their tight-fitting sharkskin armor gleamed darkly as they swooped down upon us. Eagerly I watched my friend. In the clasping talons of his left hand he held a long, slim flask that glinted even in the dim, confusing twilight. Two others, mates to his first, dangled at his waist. Lifting it high above his head, he swung his metal-clad right arm and shattered the flask he held in his taloned left hand. For an instant, nothing happened, save that the bits of broken glass shimmered their way to the sand. Then the horde of noseless ones seemed to have dissolved as hundreds of limp and sprawling bodies sank to the sand. Perhaps half of that great multitude seemed struck dead. "Hydrocyanic acid, Taylor. Even diluted with seawater, it kills almost instantly. Now go back and make sure none of that girl's people come back before the currents wash this away, or they'll go in the same fashion. Warn her to keep them back." I hurried toward the Santa Maria, thinking urgent warnings for Aimee's benefit. "Stay back, Aimee. The Roran are falling to the sand. We've made many of them dead, but the danger for you and your people is still here. Stay back." "Truly did the Roran become dead? I'd like to see that. Be careful they don't make you dead. And your friend, for that matter. They have large brains, these Roran." "Don't come to see with your own eyes, or you'll be like the Roran." I hurried around the submarine to keep her back by force if that were necessary. "You must—" "No, Taylor, these devils have got me." "Right, with you." I turned and hurried back as swiftly as I could, stumbling over the bodies of dead Roran that had settled everywhere on the clean yellow sand. I found Mercer in the grip of 6 of the shark-faced creatures. They were trying desperately to stab him, but their knives bent and broke against the metal of his armor. So busy were they with him that they didn't notice me coming up, but finding their weapons useless, they simply snatched him up, one in either arm and either leg, and 2 grasped him by the headpiece, and darted away with him, carrying his bulging metal body between them like a battering ram, while he kicked and struggled impotently. "They're taking him to the place of darkness. Quickly follow toward the direction of your best hand. You're right, I'll follow." No, stay back." I warned her frantically. All but these 6 Roran had fallen victims of Mercer's hellish poison, and while they seemed to be suffering no ill effects, I thought it more than likely that some sly current might bring the deadly poison to the girl, did she come this way, and it would kill her surely as it had killed these hundreds of Roran. "To the right," she'd said, "towards the place of darkness." I hurried out of the village in the direction she'd indicated, towards the distant gleam of Mercer's armor, rapidly being lost in the gloom. "I'm coming, Mercer. Delay them as much as you can. You're going much faster than I." "I can't help myself. Much, anyway. And doing what I can. Strong. They're devilish strong, Taylor. And at close range, I can see you right. They have gill covers. Their noses were rudimentary, and..." The devil take your scientific observations. Drag, slow them down. I'm losing sight of you. For heaven's sake, create some drag. I'm doing what I... No, that's not the lady. I'm doing what I can. If only I could get a hand free. And I realized that this last part was directed at his captors and plunged on. Huge monstrous growths swirled around me like living things. My feet crunched on shelled things and sank into the soft and slimy creeping things on the bottom. I cursed the water that held me back so gently yet so firmly. I cursed the armor that made it so hard for me to move my legs. But I kept on, and at last I began to gain on them. I could see them quite distinctly, bending over Mercer, working on him. Do your best, Taylor. We're on the edge of a sort of a cliff, a fault in the structure of the ocean bed. They're tying me with strong cords of leather, trying a huge stone on my body. I had a momentary flash of the scene where Mercer saw it at this moment. A horrid, noseless face, as Mercer saw it in that instant. The other noseless face, close to his. Sorry, I lost my place. I had a momentary flash of the scene as Mercer saw it at that instant. The horrid, noseless face close to his, the swart bodies moving with amazing agility. And yet at his very feet, a yawning precipice. Nothing but darkness is what it held, and it led down and down into nothingness. Sorry, I'm going to move just a hair so I can stand. At least attempt to stay awake. Because as much as I'm enjoying this, reading kind of puts you to sleep, you know? Anyway. Run quickly. That's the place of darkness where we take those whom the 5 deem worthy of last punishment. They'll tie the stone to him and bear him out above the blackness, and they'll let him go. Quickly. I was almost upon them now, and one of the 6 turned and saw me. 3 of them darted toward me, while the others held Mercer flat upon the edge of the precipice. They had only realized that by rolling his armored body a foot or 2 he would sink without the stone, but they didn't. Their brains had little reasoning power, apparently. The attaching of a stone was necessary in their experience, and so it was necessary now. With my left hand, I unhooked my light, and I already gripped my knife in my right hand. Swinging the light sharply against my leg, I struck the toggle switch, and a beam of intense brilliancy shot through the gloom. It aided me as I thought it would, it blinded these large-eyed denizens of the deep. Swiftly I struck out with the knife. It hacked harmlessly into the shark-skinned garment of one of the men, and I stabbed out again. 2 of the men leaped for my right arm, but the knife found, this time, the throat of a third. My beam of light now showed palely red, for the moment, and the body of a Roran toppled slowly into the bed of the ocean. The 2-faced shark creatures were hammering at me with their fists, dragging at my arms and legs, but I plunged on desperately toward Mercer. Myriads of fish, all shapes and colors and sizes, attracted by the light, swarmed around us. Good work! See if you can break this last flask of acid here at my waist. See if you can... With a last desperate plunge, fairly dragging the 2 Roran who tugged at me, I fell forward, and with the clenched steel talons in my right hand, I struck at a silvery flask I could see dangling from Mercer's waist. I hit it, but only a glancing blow. The flask didn't shatter. Again, it's heavy annealed glass hydrocyanic acid, just such terrible stuff, even the fumes. I paid but a slight heed to his word. The 2 Roran dragged me back, but I managed to crawl forward on my knees, and with all my strength I struck at the flask again. This time it shattered, and I lay where I fell, sobbing with weakness, looking out through the side window of my headpiece. The 5 Roran seemed to suddenly lose their strength. They struggled limply for a moment, and then floated down to the waiting sand beneath us. Finish, and just in time. Let's see if we can make our way back to this Monte Maria. We were weary and we plodded along slowly, twin trails of air bubbles like plumes waving behind us, rushing upwards to the surface. I felt strangely alone at the moment, isolated, cut off from all mankind on the bottom of the Atlantic. Coming to meet you, all of us. Be careful where you step so you do not walk in a circle and find again the place of darkness. It's very large. It's probably some uncharted deep, only the larger ones have been located. For my part, I was too weary to think. I just staggered on. A group of slim, darting white shapes surrounded us, and they swam before us, showing the way. The 5 patriarchs walked majestically before us, and with us, smiling at us through the thick lenses of our headpieces, walked me. Oh, it was a triumphal procession, and had I been less weary, I presume I'd have felt quite the hero. What I should have done was, a friend of mine, actually the same friend who did this art that's on screen, got me an early birthday present of a tea that's yerba and peppermint and licorice, and it's delicious. And I should have just put that in my cup and let it steep, and then filtered it, just drank it with a yerba straw. But I didn't want to let the licorice over steep. And I didn't have time to grab a hot water. But oh well, next time. Next time I feel like caffeine, I think I'll do that. Anyway, Amy pictured for us as we went along the happiness and the gratefulness of her people. Already, she informed us, great numbers of the young men were clearing away the bodies of the dead Rorn. She was so happy she could hardly restrain herself. In a dim skeleton shape bulked up at my left. I turned to look at it, and Amy, watching me through the lights of my headpiece, nodded and smiled. Yes, this was the very hulk by which she'd been swimming when the shark had attacked her, the shark which had been the very cause of the accident. She darted on to show me the very rib upon which her head had struck, stunning her so that she had drifted, unconscious and storm-tossed, to the shore of the mercer's estate. I studied the wreck. It was battered and tilted on its beam ends, but I could still make up the high deck that marked it as a very old ship. It's a Spanish galleon, Mercer. I believe so. And then in pictured form for Amy's benefit, it's been here. It's been here while much time has passed. Yes, since before my people were here, a Rorn we made prisoner once told us his people discovered it first. They went into this strange skeleton, and inside there were many blocks of this very bright stone. She pictured quite clearly bars of dully glinting bullion. Evidently, the captive had told his story well. These stones which were so bright, the Rorn took to their city, which is 3 swims distant. How far that might be, I couldn't even guess. A swim, it seemed, was the distance a Timorn could travel before the need for rest became imperative. There were many Rorn, and they took each one stone, and of them they made a house for their leader. The leader, as she pictured him, being the most hideous travesty of a thing in semi-human form the mind could imagine. Incredibly old and wrinkled and ugly and gray, his noseless face seamed with cunning, his eyes red-rimmed and terrible, his teeth gleaming, white and sharp like fangs. A whole house except for the roof. It's there now, and it's gazed at with much admiration by all the Rorn. All this our prisoner told us before we took him with a rock made fast to him, out over to the place of darkness. He too was very proud of their leader's house. Treasure! If we could find the city of Rorn, we might make the trip pay for itself. And I could sense his wave of amusement in reply. I think I'd rather stand it myself. These Rorn don't appeal to me. It was over a half hour before we were at last free of our diving suits, and the first thing Captain Bonnet said was,
"We've got to get to the surface and that quickly. Our air supply is running incredibly low. By the time we blow out the tanks, we'll be just about out. Foul air will keep us here until we rot." Sorry, sir, that's the way the matters stand.
Mercer, white-faced and ill, stared at him dazedly. Air? I knew just how he felt. We should have lots of air. The specifications...
We're dealing with facts, not specifications, sir. Another 2 hours here and we won't leave ever.
And it can't be helped, Captain. We'll go up and back for more compressed air. We must remember to plot our course exactly. You kept the record on the way out as I instructed you.
Yes, sir.
Just a minute, then. Weakly, he made his way forward to the little cubbyhole in which was housed the central station of his thought telegraph. I didn't even inspect the gleaming maze of apparatus. I merely watched him dully as he plugged in an antenna similar to the one we'd left with me and adjusted the things on his head. His eyes brightened instantly. She's still wearing her antenna. I'll tell her something happened. We must leave, that we'll return. He sat there, frowning intently for a moment, and then dragged the antenna wearily from his head. He touched a switch somewhere, and several softly glowing bulbs turned slowly red and then dark. You and I had better go to bed. We overdid it. She understands, I think. Terribly sorry, terribly disappointed. Some sort of celebration planned, I gather. Captain Bonnet.
Yes, sir.
You may proceed now as you think best. We're retiring. Be sure and chart the course back so we may locate this spot again.
Yes, sir.
When I awoke, we were at anchor. Our deck barely awash before the deserted beach of... When I awoke, we were at anchor. Our deck barely awash before the deserted beach of Mercer's estate. Still feeling none too well, Mercer and I made our way to the narrow deck. Captain Bonnet was waiting for us, spruce in his blue uniform, his shoulders bowed as always.
Good morning, gentlemen. The open air seems good, doesn't it?
And it did. There was a fresh breeze blowing in from the Atlantic, and I filled my lungs gratefully. I hadn't realized, until that instant, just how foul the air below had been. Very fine, Captain. You've signaled the men on shore to send out a boat to take us off?
Yes, sir. I believe they're launching her now.
And the chart of our course. Did the return trip check with the other?
Perfectly, sir.
Captain Bonnet reached in an inner pocket of his double-breasted coat, extracted 2 folded pages, and extended them with a little bow to Mercer. Just as Mercer's eager fingers touched the precious papers, however, the wind whisked them from Bonnet's grasp and whirled them into the water. Bonnet gasped and gazed after them for a split second, and then, barely pausing to tear off his coat, he plunged over the side. He tried desperately, but before he could reach either one of the tossing white specks, they were washed beneath the surface and disappeared. 10 minutes later, his uniform bedraggled and shapeless, he pulled himself on deck.
I'm sorry, sir. Sorrier than I can say. I tried.
Mercer, white-faced and struggling with his emotions, looked down and turned away. You don't remember the bearings, I suppose.
I'm sorry, no.
Thank you, Captain, for trying so hard to recover the papers. You'd better change at once. The wind is sharp. The captain bowed and disappeared down the conning tower, and then Mercer turned to me, and a smile struggled for life. Well, Taylor, we helped her out anyway, he said slowly. I'm sorry that, Amy will misunderstand when we don't come back. But, Mercer, perhaps we'll be able to find our way back to where you thought before. You know that... I can see now what an utterly wild goose chase it would have been. No, friend, it would have been impossible. And Amy will not think to come again to guide us. She'll think we've deserted her. And, perhaps it is as well. After all, the photographs and the data I wanted would do the world no practical good. We did Amy and her people a good turn. Let's content ourselves with that. I, for one, am satisfied. Well, I suppose myself as well, old-timer. Here's the boat. Shall we go ashore? I said, placing my hand affectionately upon his shoulder. And so we did go ashore, silently. And as we got out of the boat and set foot again upon the land, We both turned and looked out across the smiling Atlantic, dancing brightly in the sun. The mighty, mysterious Atlantic, home of Amy and her people. Well, that was that was another really good one. Just like the first one. Very good. Very, very good short story, I'd say. Oh. Oh. Goodness gracious. You know, I really should remember to sleep. It's good for you. Not atrocious, not the best thing. If you ask me, anyway. Anyway, oh boy. We're at the beginning of a 4-part novel now. Let's look at the table of contents and see what we have for this book. So we've got the beginning of this 4-part novel, and then we've got another part of the moon story, where the dude was mining, I think, radium on the moon, and the things are happening, and then there's a couple stories after that. But anyway, let's I haven't decided on the reader letters. I'll see what all y'all have to say about it, but I digress. Let's get into Murder Madness by Murray Leinster. The engines of the Almirante Gomez were going dead slow. Away up beside her monster funnels, her siren blew dismally. Whee-oo, whee-oo, and was silent for the regulation period, then blew desolately again into the clinging gray mist that ringed her all about. The deck was wet and glistening. Droplets of water stood upon the deck stanchions and dripped from the outer edge of the roof above the promenade deck. A thin, swirling fog lay soggily upon the water, and the big steamer went ahead, dead slow upon her course, sending dismal and depressing blasts from her horn from time to time. It was barely possible to see from one side of the ship to the other, and it was surely impossible to see the bow from a point half astern. Charlie Bell went forward along the promenade deck. He passed Senor Ortez, ex-minister of the Interior of the Argentine Republic. Ortez bowed to him punctuously. Punctuously? Punctuous? Yeah, punctuous. Showing great attention to detail, so punctuously. Punctiliously. Yeah. Anyway, I'm quibbling over a word. Anyway, he did it formally. But Bell had a sudden impression that the Argentine's face was gray and ghastly. He checked himself and looked back. The little man was climbing a companion ladder toward the wireless room. And so Bell slipped on toward the bow. He didn't want to give an impression of furtiveness, but the Almirante Gomez was 12 days out of New York, and Bell was still entirely ignorant of why he was on board. He'd been called to the office of his chief in the State Department and told curtly that his request for leave of absence had been granted, and Bell had not asked for a leave of absence. But at just that moment, he saw a rubber band on the desk of his immediate superior, a fairly thick rubber band which had been tied into a certain intricate knot, and so Bell had kept quiet. He went to his apartment, found his bags packed and tickets to the Rio, via the Almirante Gomez, in an envelope upon his dressing table, and went out and caught a train to the ship. And that was all he knew. The siren up above blared dolefully into the fog. It was damp and soggy and depressing. The other passengers were under cover, and the decks seemed to be deserted. From the saloon came the sound of music. Bell pulled the collar of his light topcoat about his throat and strolled on toward the bow. He faced a row of steamer chairs. There was a figure curled up in one of them. Paula Canalejas, muffled up against the dampness and staring somberly out into the mist. Bell had met her in Washington, and liked her a great deal, but he swore softly at sight of her, in his way. The afternoon before, he'd been a stoker on the The afternoon before, he'd seen a stoker on the Almirante Gomez pick up a bit of rope and absently tie knots in it, while he exchanged Rabelaisian humor with his fellows. He hadn't looked at Belle at all, but the knots he tied were the same that Belle had last seen tied in a rubber band on a desk in the State Department in Washington. And Belle knew a recognition signal when he saw one. The stoker would be off watch just now, and by all the rules of reason, he ought to be out here on the forecastle, waiting for Belle to turn up and receive instructions. But Belle paused, lit a cigarette carefully, and strolled forward. "Mr. Belle." He stopped and beamed fatuously at her. It had been logical for him to fall in love with her, and it's always desirable to seem logical. He'd striven painstakingly to give the impression he'd fallen for her, and then striven even more painstakingly to keep from doing it. "Oh, hello. What are you doing out on deck?" Brown eyes regarded him speculatively. "Thinking about you, Mr. Bell." Bell beamed at this comment. "Thinking is usually a bad habit, especially in a girl. But if you must think I approve of your choice of subject, what were you thinking about me?" The eyes regarded him still more speculatively. I was wondering if you happen to be a member of the United States Secret Service," said Paula, glancing to either side. Belle laughed with entire naturalness. "Good Lord, no. I have a desk in the State Department building, and, well, I read consular reports all day long and write letters bedeviling the consuls for not including unavailable statistics in their communications. That's my usual work. I'm on leave now." At this she looked skeptical, and it might have been disappointed. "You look as if you didn't believe me. I give you my word of honor I'm not a member of the United States Secret Service. Will that do to relieve your suspicions?" "I believe you, but it doesn't relieve my mind. I shall think about other people. I have something important to tell a member of the United States Secret Service." "I'm sorry that I can't oblige you by tipping one of them off. That's what you wanted me to do, yes?" She nodded, and the gesture was very much like a dismissal. Belle frowned, hesitated, and then continued. He was anxious to meet the stoker, but this... The siren droned dismally over his head. Fog lay deep about the ship. The washing of the waves and dripping of the water on the decks was depressing. It seemed to be getting thicker. 4 stanchions ahead, the mist was noticeable. He found that he could count 5, 6, 7, and the 8th was indefinite. But a bar materialized in the fog before him, and the grayness drew away from him, before, and closed in behind. When he was at the forward end of the promenade, looking down upon the forecastle deck, he was isolated. He heard some footsteps some distance overhead. A watch officer was up on the bridge. Bell glanced up and saw him as an indistinct figure. He waited until the officer paced over to the opposite end of the bridge, and the air throbbed and shook with the roaring of the siren. Bell slipped over the edge of the rail and swung swiftly down the little ladder of iron bars set into the ship's structure. In merely seconds he had landed and was down upon the terra incognita of all passengers, the deck reserved for the use of the crew. A mast loomed overhead with its heavy, clumsy derrick booms. A winch was by his side. Oddments of deck machinery inexplicable to a landsman formed themselves vaguely in the mist. The fog was thicker naturally, since the deck was closer to the water's edge. "Hey, passengers ain't allowed out here." An unshaven, soot-smeared figure loomed up. Bell couldn't see the man save as a blur in the mist, but he said cheerfully, "Well, I know, but I wanted to look. Seafaring's a trade I'd like to know something about." The figure grunted. Bell had just given his word of honor that he wasn't a member of the Secret Service, and he wasn't. But he was in the trade, which had no official existence anywhere. And the use of the word in his first remark was a recognition symbol. "What is your trade, anyway?" I sharpen serpent's teeth from time to time, offered Bell amiably. He recognized the man, suddenly. Hello, Jameson. You look like the devil. Jameson drew nearer and he grunted softly.
I know it. Listen closely, Bell. Your job's getting some information from Canalejas, Minister of War in Rio. He sent word up to Washington he's got something important to say. It isn't treachery to Brazil, because he's a decent man. 7 Secret Service men have disappeared in South America within 3 months. They found the 8th, and he's kind of gone crazy. Something's driven him mad. They say it's a devilish poison. He's a homicidal maniac, returning to the United States in a straitjacket. Canalejas knows what happens to the Secret Servicemen. He said so, and he's going to tell us. His daughter brought the news to Washington. Instead of going on to Europe as she was supposed to do, she started back to Rio. You're to get this information, pass it on to me. Then try and keep your skin whole and act innocent. You were picked out because as a State Department man, hell could be raised if you vanished. Understand?
And Bell nodded at this.
Something horrible's going on. Secret Service can't do anything. The man in Annuncion isn't dead. He's been seen, but he's cut loose. Servicemen don't often do that. He won't report. Means the service code may have been turned over. Held to pay generally. It's up to the trade.
I've got it. Here are 2 items for you. Miss Canalejas said she suspected I was Secret Service. I convinced her I wasn't. She says she has important information for a serviceman. The brawny figure of the stoker growled.
Ugh, women. She was told somebody'd be sent to see her father. She was shown a recognition nod with the outsider's variation. Given one for father. That'll identify you to him. But she shouldn't have talked. Now be careful. As nearly as we know, that chap in the straitjacket was given some poison that drove him insane. There are hellish drugs down there. Maybe the same thing happened to others. Look out for yourself and give me the information Canalejas gives you as quickly as God will let you. If anything happens to you, we want to get the stuff to get. We want the stuff to get back. Understand?
Of course. He carefully didn't shiver as he realized what Jameson meant by anything happening to him. The other item is that Ortez, ex-minister of the Interior of the Argentine, is scared to death about something, sending radios right and left.
One of our men vanished in Buenos Aires. Watch him. You friendly?
Yes.
Get friendlier. See what he's got. Now shoot.
Bell swung up the ladder again, and mist opened before him and closed again behind. He climbed over the rail to the promenade deck and felt a little flare of irritation. There was clearly a figure watching him. He slipped to the deck and grinned sheepishly at Paula Canalejas. She stood with her hands in the pockets of her little sport coat. Regarding him very gravely. I suppose that I look like a fool, but I've always wanted to climb up and down that ladder. I suppose it's a survival from the age of childhood. At the age of 7, I longed to be a fireman. I wonder. Mr. Bell, I'm taking a desperate chance. For the sake of my father, I wish certain things known. I think that you're an honorable man, and I think that you lied to me just now. Go and see Senor Ortez. Your government will want to know what happens to him. Go. See him quickly. Bell felt the same flare of irritation as before. These folks didn't follow rules, and they wouldn't follow rules. They depended on intuition, which was sometimes right, but sometimes led to ungodly errors. Paula was right this whole time, but she could have been as wholly and hopelessly wrong as just the average person if she'd talked to anyone else. My child, said Bell paternally. He was at least 2 years older than Paula. You should be careful. I won't lie to you just now. I'm not Secret Service. But I happen to know that you have a tiny piece of string to give your father, and I beg you not to show that to anyone else. And well, you're probably watched. You must not talk seriously to me. He lifted his hat and stared astern. He was more than merely irritated. He was almost frightened. Because the trade officially doesn't exist at all, and everybody in the trade is working entirely on his own. Because of that, people who suspect there's a trade and dislike it are not their own, but have plenty of resources behind them. And yet it is requisite that the trade should succeed in the various missions. Always. That's getting worse as time goes by. Oh. This is kind of interesting. It's certainly not as bad as the tank story. I mean, we open with, intrigue and a secret society, so not a bad idea. The government of the United States, you understand, will admit that it is a secret service which it strives to identify solely with the pursuit of counterfeiters, postal thieves, and violators of the prohibition laws. Strongly pressed, it will admit that some members of the Secret Service work abroad, the official explanation being that they work abroad to forestall smugglers. And in a pinch and in confidence, they may concede the existence of a secret diplomatic agent. But there's no such thing as the trade. Not at all. The funds which the members of the trade expend are derived by very devious bookkeeping from the appropriations allotted to an otherwise honestly conducted department of the United States government. Therefore, the trade does not really exist. You might say there's a sort of conspiracy among certain people who do certain things. Some of them are government officials, major and minor. Some of them are private citizens, reputable and otherwise. One or two of them are in jail, but both here and abroad, anyway. But as far as the government of the United States is concerned, certain fortunate coincidences happen now and again that are pure coincidences, and the trade which arranges for them does not exist, but it has a good many enemies. The foghorn howled dismally overhead. Mist swirled past the ship, and an oily swell surged vaguely overside and disappeared into a gray oblivion half a ship's length away. Bell moved on toward the stern. It was his intention to go into the smoking room and idle ostentatiously. Perhaps he'd enter into another argument with a Brazilian air pilot who had so much confidence in Handley Page wing slots. Bell in Washington had a small private plane that he explained was given to him by a wealthy aunt, who had hoped he would break his neck in it. He considered that wing slots interfered with stunting. He had picked out this door with his eye when he espied a small figure standing by the rail. It was Ortez, the Argentine ex-cabinet minister, staring off into the grayness and seeming to listen with all his ears. Bell slowed up. The little stout man turned and nodded to him, and then put out his hand.
Senor Bell, tell me, will you hear airplane motors?
Bell listened for a moment, and this is what he heard. The drip, drip, drip of condensed mist. The shuddering of the ship with her motors going dead slow. The tinkling, muted notes of piano inside the saloon. Sorry, that's not what I was going for, but you guys get, if that worked, the noise out of my headphone for a second. The washing and hissing of the waves outside. That was all. Why, no, I don't. Rather, why, no, I don't. Sound travels freakishly in the fog, though. One could be quite close and we might hear it. But we're 150 miles off the Venezuelan coast, aren't we? Ortiz turned and faced him. Bell was shocked at the expression on the small man's face. It was drained of all blood, and its look was ghastly, but the rather fine, dark eyes were steady.
We are,
agreed Ortiz, very stealthily indeed.
but I have received a radiogram that some airplanes should fly near this ship, and it would amuse me to hear it.
Belle frowned at the fog. I've I've done a good bit of flying, and if I were flying out at sea right now, I'd dodge this fog bank. It'd be practically suicide to try and alight in a mist like this. Ortiz regarded him carefully. It seemed to Belle that sweat was coming out of the other man's forehead.
You mean that an airplane could not land?
It might try, but you couldn't judge your height above the water. You might crash right out into it and drive under. Matter of fact, you probably would. Ortiz's nostrils quivered a little.
I told him it was not wise to risk.
He stopped and looked suddenly at his hands, clenching them upon the rail. A depth of pallor even greater than his previous terrible paleness seemed to leave even his lips without blood. He wavered on his feet as if he were staggering. You're sick. Instinctively, Belle moved forward. The dark eyes regarded him oddly. Ortiz suddenly took his hands from the railing of the promenade deck, and he looked at his fingers detachedly, and Belle could see them writhing, opening and closing in a horribly sensitive fashion, as if they were possessed of devils and altogether beyond the control of their owner. And he suddenly realized that the steady, grim regard with which Ortiz looked upon his hands was exactly like the look he'd seen upon a man's face once, when he saw a venomous snake crawling toward him and had absolutely no weapon. Ortiz was looking at his fingers as a man might look at cobras at the end of his wrists, very calmly but with a still, stunned horror. He lifted his eyes to Belle.
I have no control over them. My hands are useless to me, Senor Bell. I wonder if you will be good enough to assist me to my cabin.
Again that deadly pallor flashed across his face, and Belle caught at his arm. What's the matter? Of course I'll help you. Ortiz smiled very faintly.
If my airplane arrives in time, something may be done. But you've rid me of even that hope. I've been poisoned, Senor Bell.
But the ship's doctor... Ortiz, walking rather stiffly beside Belle, shrugged.
We can do nothing. Will you be good enough to open this door for me and, well, assist me and put my hands in my pockets? I cannot, but I would not like them to be seen in such a state.
Belle took hold of the writhing fingers, and he saw sweat standing out upon Ortiz's forehead. The fingers closed savagely upon Belle's hands, tearing at them, and Ortiz looked at him with a ghastly supplication.
But now if you open the door, Senor Bell...
Belle slid the door aside, and they went in together. People were making the best of the boresome weather within, frankly yawning, most of them. The card room would be full, and the smoking room still would be busy.
My cab was upon the next deck below. We will descend the stairs.
Belle went with him, his face expressionless.
My cabin should be unlocked.
And so it was. Ortiz entered, and with his hands still in his pockets, indicated a steamer trunk.
Please, open that. I thought I'd seen warning enough. It hasn't been so severe before. Right at the top.
Belle flung the top back. A pair of bright and shiny candy cuffs. A pair of bright and shiny handcuffs lay on top of a dress shirt.
Yes, put them upon my wrist, please. The poison that's given to me is peculiar. I believe one of your compatriots has experienced its effects.
Belle started slightly, and Ortiz eyed him steadily.
Precisely.
Ortiz, with his mask a grey face of horror, spoke with a steadiness Bell could never have accomplished.
A poison, Senor Bell, which is made a member of the Secret Service of the United States, a homicidal maniac. It's been given to me. I've been hoping for a chance to do it, but... Quick, Senor Bell, quick, the handcuffs.
Alright, folks, I'm going to take a little breather. Get a good stretch in. I'd suggest y'all get a good stretch in. Maybe get some exercise, you know. It's not good to sit still. Rather, it's not that good. It's not good for you to sit down this long. Alright, did everyone get up, get a drink, maybe get a snack? Get some movement in your life? You know, that's important. It's certainly better warm. But I guess I can note that for when I really need the caffeine. Anyway, folks, let us move on to chapter 2 of our interesting story here. The throbbing of the engines went on at an unvarying tempo. There was the slight, almost infinitesimal tremor of their vibration. The electric light in the cabin wavered rhythmically with its dynamo. From the open porthole came the sound of splashing water, and now and then a sound of laughter or of speech, disconnected, and came down from the main saloon. Ortiz lay upon the bed, exhausted.
It's perhaps humorous, Senor Bell,
He said presently in the same steady voice that he'd used upon the deck.
but it is undoubtedly humorous that I should call upon you. I believe you are allied with the Secret Service of your government.
I started to shake my head, or rather Bell started to shake his head but was still. He said nothing.
I'm poisoned,
said Ortiz. He tried to smile, but it was ghastly.
It's a poison which makes a man bad in a very horrible fashion. If I could use my hands and could trust them, I would undoubtedly, well, end things. It'd be entirely preferable instead, I hope.
He broke off short and listened intently. His forehead beaded.
Is that an airplane, Buddha?
Bell went to the port and listened. The washing of waves, the throbbing of the ship's engines, a dismal, drawn-out moaning of the foghorn, nothing else, and then a dim and distant muttering. It drew nearer and died away again. Yes, there is a plane. It's, out of hearing now. Ortiz clamped his jaws together.
I was about to speak to tell you many things which your government should know. Instead, I should ask you to go to the wireless room and have the operator try to get in touch with that plane. It's a two-motored seaplane and it has a wireless output. It will answer the call MSTR. Ask him to use his directional wireless to try to guide it to the ship. It brings the antidote to the poison which affects me.
Bell made for the door, and Ortiz raised his hand with a ghastly smile.
Close the door tightly, I feel as if I should be unpleasant.
Closing the door behind him, Bell felt rather like a man in a nightmare. He made for the stairway, bolted for the deck, and fairly darted up the ladder to the wireless room. Ortiz sent me. You heard that plane just now. See if you can get it. The operator looked up at him beneath a green eye shade and grinned crookedly. Talking to him now. The key flicked up and down, and a tiny dancing spark leapt into being and vanished beneath its contact point. The wireless room was dark, save for the bright, shaded light above the sending table. A file of sent messages by an elbow. A pad for messages received was by a hand. Stray wreaths of tobacco smoke floated about the room, leaping into view as they drifted beneath the lamp. Is he bad? Asked the operator fascinatedly, his eyes fixed on his key. Bell felt his eyelids flicker a moment. Very bad. They tell me your hands get working and you can't stop them. Now I'm playing the master's game. The key stopped and he listened. They're gonna try and swoop over the ship and drop it. I don't think they can, but tell Ortiz they're going to try. Bell's eyes were narrow. It wasn't customary for a radio operator on a passenger ship to speak of an ex-cabinet minister of the Argentine Republic by his surname only. It bespeaks either impertinence or a certain very peculiar association. Bell frowned imperceptibly for a moment, thinking. You had it? Heavens, no, I never took the chance. I saw the red spots once and I went to rib. Say, you got a password? He was staring up at Bell, and Bell shrugged. I'm trying to help Senor Ortiz now. The operator continued to stare, his eyes full of suspicion, and then he grimaced. Yeah, all right, go tell him they're gonna drop it. Bell went out. There was the gray fog and the washing seas, and the big ship plowing steadily on toward the south. The horn blared, startlingly loud and unspeakably doleful. Bell listened for other sounds, and there were none. Down the steep ladder to the promenade deck, Paula Canalejas nodded to him. I saw you speak to Senor Ortiz. You see? Bell was beginning to have a horrible, peculiar suspicion. It was incredible, but it was inevitable. I think I see, but I don't dare believe it. Keep quiet and don't speak to me unless I give you some sign it's safe. It's hellish. He went inside and swiftly down the stairs. He found a steward hesitating outside the door of Ortiz's cabin and touched Bell's arm anxiously as he was about to go in. Beg pardon, sir. I heard Ortiz making some very strange noises. I thought he was sick. He is. He told me he doesn't want a doctor, though. I'm looking after him. He closed the door behind him, and Ortiz grinned at him. It was a horrible, terrific grin, and Ortiz fought it from his face with a terrific effort of will. There was a foam about his lips.
Dios, it was devilish. Senor, bear that amigo mío, for the love of... Get my revolver from my trunk, give it to me.
Bell said shortly. The airplane just radioed that it's trying to swoop overhead and drop a package on board the steamer. It doesn't dare alight in the fog.
I think it would be well to try my feet. Tie them fast when the package comes if I'm unpleasant. Knock me unconscious, pour it in my mouth. I fear it's too late now, but try it anyway.
Through the port came the muttering of a seaplane's engines. The noise died away, and almost instantly the siren boomed hoarsely.
There it is. Senor Bell, I think it's too late. Would you assist me out on deck where I might fling myself aboard? I think I can control my legs only so long.
Steady now, said Bell, wrenched by the sight of the man before him fighting against an unnameable horror. Tell me.
It's poison. Ghastly, terrible poison in the Indies. But of course one would say drives a mad, murder mad, as if he was possessed by a devil. First his hands were fused to obey him, his feet, and then his body, as the devil seized hold of his body, carried about doing murder with it. Upon the brain-driven insane, a man was about shrieking with the horror of what primed his body covered, until the poison reached what portion of that brain as well, and he's mad forever. That's what I face, amigo mio. And that's why I beg you, I implore you to kill me or assist me inside the ship so that I may do it myself. The master has administered it to me secretly and demanded treason as the price of the antidote. He to
Steady and strong, rising from a muttering to a steady roar, the sound of airplane motors came through the port, and Bell started up. Hold fast, I'll go get that package when it lands. Hold fast, I tell you. Fight it. He flung out of the cabin and raced up the stairs. The door to the deck was open, and he crowded through a group of passengers who had discounted the dampness for sake of a novelty, an aeroplane far out at sea, and raced to the upper deck. The roaring noise was receding, and the siren roared hoarsely. And then the noise came back. For minutes, the sheep, yes, baba, they're clopping along on the ocean. No, for minutes then the ship seemed to play hide and seek with invisible flyers. The roaring noise overhead circled about, now near, now seeming very far away. And the siren sent its dismal blasts out into the grayness all about. Then, for an instant, a swiftly scudding shadow was visible overhead. It banked steeply and vanished, and seemed to have turned and gone lower when it reappeared a moment later. It wasn't distinct at first. It was merely a silhouette of darker gray against the all-enveloping mist. But its edges sharpened and became clear. One could make out its struts, an aileron's trailing edge. I've got nerve, anyhow. It swept across the ship and disappeared, but the noise of its engines didn't dwindle, more than a little. The blast of the siren seemed to summon it back again, and once more it came in sight, this time diving steeply. It flashed across the forecastle deck amid a hideous uproar, desperately, horribly close to the dangling derrick cables, and was gone. Bell had seen it more clearly than anyone else on the ship, perhaps. He saw a man in the pilot's cockpit, between wings and tail, reach high and fling something downward, something with a long streamer attached to it. Bell had an instant's glimpse of the goggled face, and then he was darting forward, watching the thing that fell. It took only a second, perhaps two at most, but the thing seemed to fall with infinite deliberation, the streamer shivering out behind it. It fell at a steep slant, the forward momentum of the plane's speed added to its own drop. It swooped down, slanting toward the rail, and Bell groaned. It struck the rail itself and bounced. A sailor flung himself toward it, and the streamer slipped from his fingers and slithered over the side. Bell was at the railing, just in time to see it drop into the water. He opened his mouth to shout and saw it sink. The last of the streamer followed the dropped object down into the green water when it was directly below him. His hands clenched. Bell stared sickly at the spot where it had vanished, and an instant later he had whirled and was thrusting wide the wireless room door. The operator was returning to his key, grinning crookedly. He looked up sideways. Tell them it went oversized. Tell them to try it again. Oh, Jesus in hell, try again. He's dying. The operator looked up fascinatedly, his fingers working the key.
Is he bad?
He's dying, snarled Bell in a rage of his helplessness. He'd forgotten everything but the fact that a man below decks was facing the most horrible fate that it can overtake a man, and facing with it a steadfast gameness that made Bell's heart go out to him.
No, they don't die. They don't die of it.
His key stopped and he listened, and his key clicked again.
They only had 2 packages and they don't dare risk the other one. Say the fog ends 20 miles farther on. They're gonna land there, taxi back on the surface of the water. Shouldn't be more than half an hour.
He pushed himself back from the table with an air of finality.
That's all, they've signed off.
Bell felt rage sweeping over him, and the operator grinned crookedly.
Better go down and tie him up.
He licked his lips with the fascinated air of one thinking of a known and terrifying thing.
Better tie him up tight, it'll be a half an hour more.
Bell went down the companion ladder. The promenade was crowded with passengers now, asking questions of each other. Some, frowning portentously, thought the plane of an unscheduled ocean flyer had lost its way in the fog. Paulo Canalejas was close to Bell as he shouldered his way through the crowd. "And that was for him?" Bell nodded. "Tell him I pray for him." Bell nodded abruptly and went into the saloon. It was nearly empty. He wiped the sweat off his face. It was horrible to have to go down to Ortiz and tell him that at best it would be a half hour more. Then there was a sudden scream below him and a shot. Bell jumped for the stairs, his heart in his throat, and saw Ortiz coming out of the stateroom door. His eyes were wide and agonized. His body. Even the incredibly short time before he reached the bottom of the steps, Bell had time to receive the ghastly impression that Ortiz was sane, but his body had gone mad. Ortiz's face was white and horrified. His hands and arms were writhing savagely, working at the handcuffs on his wrists. His legs were carrying him in a curious padding trot down the hallway. One of the hands held a glittering revolver, and a steward was crouched behind a couch, his face white and filled with stark terror. And Ortiz held his head back as if struggling to hold back and control his body, which seemed to be under the control of a malignant demon.
"Out of the way! Get someone to kill me! Shoot me! I cannot!"
The hands leveled the revolver in spite of him, while he flung his head from side to side in a frantic attempt to disturb their aim. "Close your eyes," panted Bell, and hurled himself upon who? It wasn't Ortiz. It was Ortiz's body, gone mad, raging. The manacled arms flailed about frenziedly. The gun went off again and again, and then Bell struck. He knocked the thing that possesses Ortiz's body off of its feet. The hands groped for him. They kicked at him with the revolver. The feet kicked. "Keep your eyes closed," gasped Bell, struggling to get the gun away from the hands. "It can't see when you keep your eyes closed." Fighting insanely as the thing was fighting, he couldn't identify it with Ortiz himself. One of the hands unclosed from about the revolver and clawed at his throat. It seemed to abandon that effort and attacked Ortiz's face in a frenzy of rage, struggling to claw his eyes open. The other held the weapon fast with maniacal strength. At the horror of feeling one of his own manacled hands attacking his face savagely as if it were a sensate thing, Ortiz opened his eyes. They were wide with despair. The hand with the revolver made a sudden movement, and Bell flung his weight upon it as the clutching hand pulled the trigger. There was a deafening report, and the body seemed to weaken suddenly at Bell's grip. It fought less and less terribly, though with no lessening of its savagery. He managed to get the revolver away from the hands that shook with unspeakable rage. He flung it away and stood panting. There was a crowd of people suddenly all about the place, staring, stunned, incredulous people who regarded Bell with a dawning, damning suspicion. Ortiz spoke suddenly. His voice was weak, but it was steady and it was full of a relief.
"I wish to make a statement. I wish to, do what I've done for personal reasons. Bell tried to dissuade me. The handcuffs were there, were placed. that were upon my wrist replaced my consent. Bell is my friend, and has done me no wrong. I shot myself content.
Bell beckoned to the ship's doctor. Get him bandaged up. Get him bandaged up. Get him bandaged up. Get him bandaged up is what I'm trying to say. Get him bandaged up. Bandaged. Why is this word so hard? Words are hard. Get him bandaged up. There's no need for him to die. The body was writhing only feebly now. Ortiz looked up upon him and managed to smile. Again, there was that incredible impression of a body not belonging to Ortiz, or Ortiz as a sane and whole and honorable, admirable man, and the feebly writhing body with clutching hands as some evil thing that had been properly defeated and killed. The doctor bent down, and it was useless, of course. He made futile movements.
I wish to speak to my friend, Senor Bell. I have not long.
Bell knelt beside him.
The master step is in Rio,
Panted Ortiz weakly, almost a whisper.
His name is Lumiere. In Buenos Aires, I do not know. There was a man, the one who poisoned me, but I killed him secretly. I do not think the master knows. I pray that...
He stopped, and he couldn't speak again. But he smiled, and a few seconds later, Bell clenched his hands. Ortiz was gone. Someone touched his arm. Paula Canalejas. He stared down at her and tried to smile. It wasn't a very successful smile. He drew a deep breath. I would like to think that when I die, I'll die as well as this man did, but I'm afraid I won't. I think I shan't. But Paula said, The airplane can be heard outside. It seems to be moving on the surface. And so, 10 minutes later, the plane loomed up out of the mist, strangely ungainly on the surface of the water. Its motors roared impatiently as if it was held in leash. It swung clumsily about, heading off out of sight in the fog to turn. It came back, sliding along the top of the water with its wingtip floats, leaving alternate streaks of white foam behind them. A man stood up in its aftercockpit. Bell crowded to the rail. The man, goggled and masked, held up a package, as if to fling it on board, and Bell watched grimly. But he saw that the pilot checked himself and looked up at the upper deck. Bell craned his neck, where the and to see the wireless operator was waving wildly to the seaplane. He writhed his hands and held his head to his hand, as if blowing out his brains, and waved the plane away frantically. The pilot of the plane sat down, and a moment later, its motors roared more thunderously. It's not safe to alight on either land or water when the fog hangs low, but there was little danger in taking off. And so the seaplane shot away into the mist, its motors bellowing. The sound of its going changed subtly. It seemed to rise and grow more distant. Then it died away. Bell halted at the top of the companion ladder and saw the wireless operator with a crooked, nervous grin upon his face. Chapter 3. Bell saw what he was looking for out in the throng of traffic that filled the Avenida do Acre in Rio. He'd seen it over the heads of the crowd, which was undersized as most crowds of the area were, and he managed to get through the perpetual jam on the mosaic sidewalk and reach the curb. He stood there and regarded the vehicles filling the broad avenue, wearing exactly the indifferent, half-amused air of a tourist, with no place in particular to go and a great deal of time in which to go there. Taxis chuffed past, disputing the right-of-way with private cars, which were engaged in more disputes with other cars, all in the rather extraordinary bad temper and conscientiousness which comes to people behind the wheel of an automobile. Also, I should note, it's making some stereotypes out of Spanish, or just people from Latin America and Brazil, and I'm like, no, that's just true of all people. I'm like, no. Like, just now, it was like, oh man, angry temper behind the wheel of an automobile. No, everyone's angry while they're driving. At least most people I know, anyway. Myself included. I do not enjoy driving. Anyway, I digress. As if coming to an unimportant decision, Bell raised his hand to an approaching cab. It had 2 men on the chauffeur's seat, of course. All taxis in Rio carry 2 men in front. One drives, and the other lights his cigarettes, makes witty comments upon passing ladies, and helps in collecting the fares from recalcitrant passengers. The extra man's called the secretary, and he assists materially in giving an impression of haughty pride. The taxi ground to the curb. The secretary reached behind him indifferently and opened the door, where Bell didn't glance at him. He stepped inside and settled down languidly. The beer more. The taxi started off with a jolt. It's the invariable custom in Rio de Janeiro. And besides, it reminds the passenger that he is merely a customer, admitted the cab on sufferance, that he must be suitably meek to those who will presently blandly ignore the amount registered by the meter and demand a fare of from 8 to 27 times the indicated amount. The cab went shooting down the Avenida do Acre toward the harbor. The Avenida do Acre is officially the Avenida Rio Blanco, and it should be called that by that name, only people forget. The Beira Mar, however, is named with entire propriety. It's actually the edge of the sea, and it's probably one of the 2 or 3 most beautiful driveways in the world. The cab whirled past the crowded sidewalks. Incredible numbers of people with an incredible variation in the shades of their complexions moved to and fro with a particular aimlessness of a crowd of tourists. A stout and pompous politician from Bahia, wearing an orchid in his buttonhole, rubbed elbows with a striking lady at a sidewalk on his left, and forced a wizened little silk-hatted parda, approximately an octoroon, to dodge about him in order to progress. A young and languid person, his clothes the very last expiring gasp of fashion, fingered his stick patiently. He wore the painstakingly cultivated expression of bored disillusionment your young Brazilian considers aristocratic. It was very probable he shared a particularly undesirable bedroom with 4 or 5 other young men in order to purchase just such clothes and It was very probable that he shared a particularly undesirable bedroom with 4 or 5 other young men in order to purchase such clothing, but then farenda fita, making a picture, is the national Brazilian sport. Wow, man. Sometimes you can read this and it reads like actual like books you'd read now, and then other times you run across something like that and you're like, wow, this is really from the 30s, dang. Bell lit a cigarette. It was not wise to regard the secretary of this particular taxi too closely, but if his face had been thickly smeared with coal dust, and if he'd had 2 weeks' beard and been seen on the forecastle of the Almirante Gomez, one would have deduced him to be a stoker and not used the name of Jameson. The cab reached the Beira Mar and turned to take the long route about the bay. It's one of the most beautiful views to be found anywhere, and tall apartment houses have been built along its whole length to capitalize the scenery. True, the more brightly colored ladies of the capital have established themselves in vast numbers among these apartment houses, but in the languid promenades they add, let us say, the beauties of art to those of nature. A voice spoke from the chauffeur's seat.
Bell.
Right, said Bell without moving. His eyes flickered, however, and he found the device Jameson had inserted, a speaking tube of sorts, not especially efficient, but inconspicuous enough. He stirred listlessly and got his lips near it. All right to talk?
All right to talk.
Shoot. This man... Wait, no. All right to talk?
Shoot.
Said Jameson from the secretary's seat beside the chauffeur.
This man doesn't understand English. He thinks I'm in a smuggling gang. Expects to make some money out of me eventually.
Bell spoke curtly while the taxi rolled past the Morro de Gloria. Wow, I said that second R very American. While the taxi rolled past the Morro de Gloria, with its quaint old church, and went along the winding, really marvelous driveway, past many beaches with the incredibly blue water beyond.
Canalejas is out of town. It isn't known when he'll be back. I met his daughter at a dance in our embassy here, and she told me. We didn't dare to talk much, but she's frightened. especially after what happened to Ortiz, and I've met Ribiera, whom Ortiz named.
Bell flicked the ash from his cigarette out the door and went on quietly. He's trying to get friendly with me. I promised to call at his house and have him take me out to the flying field. He has 2 planes, he tells me, a big amphibian and a 2-seater. Uses them for commuting between Rio and his place back inland. He went out of his way to cultivate me. I think he suspects I'm trying to find out something.
Which you are. You found out that Ortiz was right at least about...
Bell nodded and frowned at himself for having nodded. He spoke to the mouthpiece by his head with an expressionless face. He's practically fawned upon by a bunch of important officials and several high-ranking army officers. Suspecting what I do, I think he's got a hold of a devil of a lot of power. Jameson scowled in lordly fashion upon a mere pedestrian who had threatened to impede the movement of the taxicab by making it run over him. Ortiz told me he'd been poisoned, and treason asked as the price of the antidote. I heard that the Brazilian Minister of Foreign Affairs went insane 6 months ago. I heard also that it was homicidal mania, murder madness. I'm wondering if these people who fawn upon Ribiera aren't paying a price for, well, antidotes or their equivalent. The Minister for Foreign Affairs may have refused, you see.
You're improving.
The taxi rounded a curve in a vista of sea and sand, and royal palms spread out before it.
Yes, you're improving. But Ortiz spoke of Ribiera only as deputy of the master. Who is the master?
Only heaven knows. He stared languidly out of the window for all the world to see. A tourist regarding the boasted beauties of the Beira Mar. Also languidly. This author is just very pleased with the word languidly. For those who don't know what languid means. Of a person, manner or gesture displaying or having a disinclination for physical exertion. So it's kind of lazily. You could have, you used lazily in addition to languidly, but this guy's just really enamored with using the word languid. It's a good word, you use it every now and again, but there are a bunch of synonyms for it, dude. Use your synonyms. Break out the thesaurus or something, jeez. Anyway.
A deputy of some unknown person called the master poisoned Ortiz in Buenos Aires. And Ortiz was an important man in the Argentine. Ribiera is merely the deputy of that same unknown master in Rio. He has generals and state presidents and big politicians playing court to him. Deputies in two countries that we know of, have so much power. How much power has the master?
Silence. The taxi chugged steadily past unnoticed beauties and colorings. Rio really is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. You think this author likes Rio? I think this author really likes Rio.
It's like this. 7 servicemen vanish, 1 goes mad. You get 2 tips, the fate of Ortiz is the fate of the 7 men. 8, in fact. We find the 2 men dispense a certain ghastly poison in 2 certain cities. The order of the man they call the master. We find that those 2 men wield an astounding lot of power, and we know that they're only deputies, only subordinates of the master. We know also that the servicemen vanished all over the continent, just not in these 2 cities. How many deputies does the master have? What's it all about? He wanted treason of Ortiz, we know. What does he want of other men that his deputies have enslaved? Why does he poison the secret servicemen? And especially why, do 2 honorable men, officials of 2 important nations, want to tip off the United States governments about our ghastly business? What's it got to do with our nation?
Bell flung away his cigarette. That last question has occurred to me too, he observed, and carefully repressed a slight shiver. I've made a guess, which is probably insane. I'm going to see Ribiera this afternoon.
He already suspects you know too much.
I am... Bell managed the ghost of a mirthless smile. I'm uncomfortably aware of it. I may need an antidote as badly as Ortiz. If I do and can't help myself, I'll depend on you.
Jameson growled at this statement.
I simply mean that I'd really rather not be, left alive if I'm mad. That's all. Ortiz knew what was the matter with him before he got bad off. I knew it was a risk. I'm gooseflesh all over. But somebody's got to take the risk. The guess I've made may be insane, but if it's right, 1 or 2 lives will be cheap enough as a price for the information. Suppose you chaps turn around and take me to Ribiera's house." There was a long pause, and then Jameson spoke in Portuguese to his companion. The taxi checked, swerved, and began to retrace its route.
"You're a junior in the trade. I can't order you to do it."
Bell fumbled with the cigarette case. "No, the trade doesn't exist, Jameson. And besides, nobody gives orders in the trade. They're only suggestions. Now shut up a while. I want to try to remember some consular reports I read once. From the consulate at Puerto Pacheco.
"What?"
The consul there was an amateur botanist. He filled up his consular reports with accounts of native Indian medicinal plants and drugs, with copious notes and clinical observations. I had to reprove him severely for taking up space with such matters, and not fully going into the exact numbers of hides, wet and dry, that passed through the markets in his district. His information will be entirely useless in the present emergency, but I'm going to try to remember as much of it as I can. Now shush." When the taxi swung off the Beira Mar to thread its way through the many tree-lined streets, it's a misdemeanor punishable by fine to cut down a tree in Rio de Janeiro, it carried a young American with the air of an accomplished idler who'd been mildly bored by the incomparable view from the waterside boulevard. When it stopped at the foot of one of the slum-covered murros that dot El Rio, and a liveried doorman came out of a splendid residence to ask the visitor his name, the taxi discharged a young American who seemed to feel the heat in spite of the swift motion of the cab. He wiped off his forehead with his handkerchief as he was assured that Senor Ribiera had given orders as he was to be admitted night or day. When the taxi drove off, it carried 2 men on the chauffeur's seat, one of whom had lost, temporarily, the manner of haughty insolence, which is normally inseparable from the secretary of a taxicab. But though he wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, Bell actually felt rather cold when he followed his guide through ornately furnished rooms, which seemed innumerable, and was at last left to wait in an especially luxurious salon. There was a pause and a rather long wait, a distinctly long wait. Bell lit a cigarette and seemed to become mildly bored. He regarded a voluptuous small statuette with every appearance of pleased interest. A subtly decadent painting seemed to amuse him considerably. He didn't seem to notice that there were no windows visible, and that shaded lamps lit this room even in broad daylight. 2 servants came in, a footman in livery and the majordomo. Your average servant is either fawning or covertly insolent. These 2 were obsequious. The footman carried a tray with a bottle, glass, ice, and a siphon.
"The Senor Ribiera begs that Senor Bell will oblige him by waiting for the shortest of moments until the Senor Ribiera can relieve himself of a business matter. It will be of the shortest of moments."
Bell felt a little instinctive chill at the sight of the bottle and glasses. "Oh, very well. You may put the tray there." The footman lifted the siphon expectantly, and Bell regarded it indifferently. The wait before the arrival of this drink had been longer than would be required, merely for the announcing of a caller and the tending of a tray, especially if such a tray were a custom of the place, the sending of a single bottle only, without inquiry to his preferences. No soda." He poured out a drink into this tinier glass. He lifted it toward his lips, hesitated vaguely, and drew out his handkerchief again. He sneezed explosively, and the drink spilled. He swore irritably, put down the glass, and plied his handkerchief vigorously. A moment later, he was standing up and pouring the drink out afresh, from the bottle in one hand to the glass in the other, and he up-tilted the glass. "Get rid of this for me," he said annoyedly of the handkerchief. He saw a nearly imperceptible glance pass between the footman and the majordomo. They retired, and Bell moved about the room exactly like a young man who has been discomfited by the necessity of sneezing before servants. Anywhere else in the world, such a pose would not have been convincing. But your Brazilian not only adopts Vanzita Fita is his advocation, but also suspects it to be everybody else's too. And a young Brazilian of the leisure class would be so horribly annoyed at it being forced to so plebeian an exhibition in public. He moved restlessly about the room, staring at the picture. Presently he blinked uncertainly and gazed about less definitely. He went down rather uncertainly into the chair he had first occupied and sat down. He poured, or at least seemed to pour, another drink, and again he sneered and looked mortified. He put down the glass with an air of finality, but looked puzzledly about him. Then he sank back in his chair and gradually seemed to sink into a sort of apathetic indifference. He looked then like a very bored young man on the verge of dozing off, but he was actually very much alert indeed. He had had the feeling of eyes upon him for a while. Then that sensation ceased, and he settled himself to wait. And meantime he felt a peculiar gratitude to the late American consul at Puerto Pacheco for his interest in medicinal plants. That gentleman had gone into the subject with a passionate. That gentleman had gone into the subject with a passionate. Okay, third time is the charm. That gentleman had gone into the subject with a passionate enthusiasm of the amateur. He had described Icus ulari and Timbo. He had particularized upon Macacanimbi and Hervamora, and he had gone into a wealth of detail concerning Yagüe, on account of its probable value if used in criminology. As consul at Puerto Pacheco, he was not altogether a success in some ways, but had invented an entirely original of experimentation upon those drugs, and poisons which did not require to be introduced to the bloodstream. His method was simplicity itself. An alcoholic solution carried a minute quantity of the drug in its vapor, just as an alcoholic solution carries a minute quantity of perfuming essential oil. He inhaled the odor of the alcoholic solution, and the effect was immediately strictly temporary and not dangerous. He was enabled to describe the odors, in some cases the taste, and in a few instances the effects of the substances he listed, from personal experience. And Bell had used his method as an unpromising but possible test for a drug in the drink that had been brought him. He'd inhaled the strangling odor of the spilled liquor on his handkerchief, and there was drug involved. For an instant he was dizzy, and for an instant he saw the room through a vivid blue haze. And something clicked in his brain and said, It's Yagüe. And the relief of dealing with something which he knew, if only at second hand, was so enormous that he almost felt weak. Yagüe, you see, is an extract from the leaves of a plant which is not yet included in materia medica. It has nearly the effect of scopolamine, once famous in connection with twilight sleep, and produces a daze of blue light, an intolerable sleepiness, and practically all the effects of hypnotism. A person under Yagüe, as under scopolamine or hypnosis, will seem to slumber and yet will obey any order by whomever given. He will answer any question without reserve or any concealment, and on awakening he will remember nothing done under the influence of the potion. The effects were not particularly harmful. Bell then sat in an apparent half-daze, half-slumber, in the salon which he waited for Ribiera to appear. He knew exactly what he was expected to do. Ribiera wanted to find out what he knew or expected about Ortiz's death. Ribiera wanted to know many things, and he would believe what Bell told him because he thought Bell had taken enough Yagüe to be practically a hypnotic subject. Let Ribiera believe what he was told. When he came into the room, bland and smiling, Bell didn't stir. He was literally crawling inside with an unspeakable repulsion to the man and the things for which he stood, but he seemed dazed and dull. And when Ribiera began to ask questions, he babbled his answers in a toneless, flat voice. He babbled very satisfactorily, in Ribiera's view. And so when Ribiera shook him roughly by the shoulder, he started and let his eyes clear. Ribiera was laughing heartily. Signor,
Hang on, I need to give this guy like a really pompous voice, and I've already given our main character like the yes.
Signor, my hospitality is at fault. You come to be my guest, and I allow you to be so bored that you drop off to sleep. I was detained for 5 minutes and came in to find you slumbering.
Bell stared ruefully about him and rubbed his eyes. I did, for a fact. I'm sorry. Up late last night. I was tired. I dropped in to see those planes you suggested I'd be interested in. But I dare say it's late now. Ribiera chuckled again. He was in his late and corpulent 40s. Corpulent 40s, rather. Corpulent, question of the day. What's that mean? Hi, just tell me what corpulent means, bro. Corpulent, of a person fat.
Alright, so he's a big, hefty guy. We could give him Ortiz's voice, because Ortiz is kind of, dead. I like that, because he's a big,
Briefly, guy, so he kind of talks like this.
If one were captious, one might object to the thickness of his lips. They suggested sensuality. There was a bare shade, more of pigment in his skin than the American passes altogether unquestioned. And his hair was wavy, but he could be a charming host.
We'll have a drink while the car's coming around the door and go out to the flying field.
No drink. I feel squeamish now. I say, haven't you changed the lamps or something? Everything looks blue. That was a lie. Everything looked entirely normal to Bell, but he looked about him as if vaguely puzzled. If he drank the liquor Ribiera had sent him, things would have a bluish tinge for some time after. But as it was, Ribiera chaffed him jovially on the way to the flying field, and introduced him to the flyers and the officials of the field. He told with gusto of Bell's falling asleep while waiting for him. A very jolly companion, this Ribiera. But Bell saw 2 or 3 men looking at him very strangely, almost sympathetically, and he noticed a little later that a surprising number of flyers and officials of the airport seemed to be concealing an abject terror of Ribiera. 1 or 2 of them seemed to hate him as well. Anyway, folks, I got a little bit of a late start today. Oh, so we're just going 2 hours. I was waiting to get to the next chapter. So we're on chapter 4, and we'll come back to the harrowing tale of Bell in, I would assume Brazil, probably. Anyway, we'll come back to the harrowing tale of Mr. Bell in Rio de Janeiro, and his struggle with the Yagué, and apparently other assorted political folks next week. But before we leave, I actually want to open my phone and find out if Yagué is an actual thing, or if the author was just pulling this out of nowhere. So let's Google Yagué. No, not a Spanish army officer. There's a football team based on the Yagué neighborhood of Logroño. It's Spanish. There's a lot of people with the last name Yagué. Okay, Yagué herb, maybe. There seems to be something called Yage, like Y-A-G-E. It's like a hallucinogenic herb. Let's try that. Yage. Okay, so this looks like the same thing without a U. Ayahuasca, or Yage, is an entheogenic brew made out of Banisteropus caapi vine and other ingredients. The brew is used as a traditional spiritual medicine in ceremonies among the indigenous people of the Amazon basin. So, what does it do? Some psychoactive effects can be felt from consuming the vine by itself. The hallucinogen DMT will be ingested in the stomach and remain inactive without the inclusion of a Maoi like Banisteropus caapi. So, a combination of both a Maoi containing plant and DMT containing substance is necessary for the full hallucinogenic effect. The resulting brew is known by a number of different names. Effects. Having spiritual revelations regarding the purpose on Earth, the true nature of the universe, how to be the best person they can. Some people view it as a spiritual reawakening. Some people feel like they can gain access to higher dimensions, make contact with extra-dimensional beings. Vomiting can follow ingestion. This purging is considered by many shamans and experienced users of it to be an essential part of the experience. It's a release of negative energy. Others report purging in the form of nausea, diarrhea, or hot-cold flashes. Okay. So, not the exact same thing described in the book. The exact same thing described in the book, there is a real herb that's called, like, I don't exactly remember what it exactly, like, off the top of my head it's called. Oh, dang, there was someone in chat. Hello. Anyway, there is a real herb called Yagüe, except it doesn't have a U, and it causes hallucinogenic effects rather than the hypnosis herb. But there is a real thing called the zombie plant. I don't remember the technical name off the top of my head, but I have the internet at my fingertips. I can find out. Hi. Zombie plant. No, not Plants vs. Zombies. This plant dies when you touch it? No. Hang on. Let's just Google hypnosis plant, because I feel like it really does exist. I've heard about something. Hypnosis plant. Scopolamine. There is actually a drug called scopolamine. Devil's breath. That's what it's called. So this thing that the book was waxing poetic about is really called scopolamine. It does exist. You fall into a zombie-like state where you'll do anything for your attacker, from empty out your bank account to pulling a trigger on someone. It's called Burundanga scopolamine, derived from nightshade plants. So it exists. It's a real thing. So, it's not something you can really buy, but it exists. So, is that that's one of Barry's emotes already? Yes, you did sub to Barry. Sorry for folks watching this on YouTube, you're confused because you don't see chat. I should probably put chat off to the right, like somewhere up in the cloud bank on the right side there, because it kind of looks unbalanced. There's a bunch of stuff happening on the left. Should probably put the chat on the right side, even though my camera's inverted, but you get the idea. That's a good emote though. Also, I have this pencil because I'm in the lounge and I had to write a sign that was like, hey, I'm recording in here, please don't burst in or shout too loudly. But anyway, I think that's going to be it for the evening, because I have a couple of small assorted homework whatnots to deal with for my database management class. Oh, look at all those love emotes. I love Jami's emotes. They're so general purpose. You see them all over the place. Anyway, I digress. Enough tittering about Twitch emotes. I have to end things off. So if you're watching this on YouTube, hey, and you want to watch this live, it's usually on Fridays around 4:30 to 5 o'clock. Generally is when I usually plan on doing it. If you don't know, I usually post on Twitter when I'm about to start, even though I didn't this time. Oops. But usually I do. Anyway, thanks for listening, folks. Hope you enjoyed the story. Come back next week to figure out just what the heck is happening with our intrepid hero, Belle. This has been Paper Cuts. I hope it didn't sting.